Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a profoundly chilling narrative, a grim, dark fable called The Sovereign of the Infinite Abyss. This isn't just your standard survival story. We're going to do a deep, psychological teardown of a figure simply known as the Wanderer, tracking his absolute descent into what the text calls the atavistic Dark Sovereign. It's an incredible look at trauma, isolation, and just how terrifyingly far the human mind will go to protect itself from pain. Let's get right into it.
To need another person is to hand them the shears to cut your throat. Yeah, let that sink in for a second. This is a direct quote from our source text, and it perfectly captures the horrifying, completely isolated psychology of the Dark Sovereign that we're about to unpack. To him, vulnerability isn't just a flaw, right? It's a fatal error. But how exactly does a mind arrive at such an incredibly unforgiving worldview?
Well, to truly understand the Wanderer's transformation, we need a framework. This fable leans heavily on the Fichtean dialectic. If you're a bit rusty on that, it's basically a model of evolution that moves through three stages. You start with a thesis, you introduce an opposing force called the antithesis, and finally they resolve into a brand new reality, which is the synthesis. And the Wanderer's journey maps onto this perfectly. Step 1, the thesis, is his original childhood trauma, being abandoned in the harsh sands. Step 2, the antithesis, is when he encounters the oasis of human warmth. But instead of this place healing him, these two opposing forces violently collide. And that results in step 3, the synthesis. He totally rejects both his victimhood and human comfort, synthesizing into the Dark Sovereign, a being of absolute, unyielding self-containment.
So let's look closer at that rejection. When the Wanderer leaves the oasis, he doesn't just casually walk away. He actively loathes the place. He views it as a trap for the weak. To him, human warmth is quite literally a poison that rots the iron of the soul. So he steps out into the infinite abyss, fully embracing his role as this nihilistic superego. He's no longer a victim. He's the atavistic Dark Sovereign, the purest expression of the desert, enforcing a clinical, unforgiving reality on a world blinded by hope. And he lays this all out through 5 distinct parables.
Section 1, Severing the Shadow of Empathy. The first is the parable of the severed shadow. Inside the temple of his own hardening, the Wanderer concludes that any connection to another person is just a fortress out of dust. It's structurally doomed to collapse from the start. He realizes that to survive the infinite abyss, he has to sever every single bond, because to him, true strength is a flame that burns entirely without fuel. It's absolute self-containment.
And this idea gets expanded in the second parable, the parable of the glass shield. The Wanderer looks at human affection and basically sees a voluntary infection that just dulls the mind. He believes a heart burdened by care is like a shield made of glass. Sure, it looks nice, but it shatters the second hard reality strikes. In his sovereign reality, to love is to mortgage your peace to the grave. Empathy isn't a virtue. It's a literal existential threat to survival.
Section 2, The Architecture of Cruelty. This brings us to the third parable, the parable of the unyielding edge. This one is governed by what he calls the law of subtraction. This is the objective force of the desert that relentlessly removes anything soft from the world, until only the jagged, hardened edges are left standing. Under this law, mercy is completely rejected. It's seen as a luxury that only the blind can afford. To the Wanderer, offering comfort to the fallen is practically an insult to existence itself. He says, the forgiving hand only invites the heavier blow. Think about that. In a world governed by the law of subtraction, the weak have to be destroyed. So to help them is to defy the very nature of the desert he now worships. But how on earth does he justify this to himself? Well, we find out in the fourth parable, the parable of the salt mirror. Deep in his own desolate psyche, he takes his formative childhood trauma, his abandonment, and completely reframes it. He doesn't see his past as a wound anymore. Instead, it was a selection process, one that he successfully passed. He literally inverts his original terror into this grim pride. His agonizing loneliness becomes his final, unyielding shape, essentially forging a crown of iron in the crucible of the abyss. It's a masterful but deeply, deeply disturbing psychological defense mechanism. Section 3, The Missionary of Desolation. In the fifth parable, the parable of the final stone, the Wanderer stops looking for a home entirely. Instead, he sets out to turn the whole world into a mirror of his own desolate heart. He actively forces others to confront his empty worldview by shattering their shields of glass. He becomes the frost that does not apologize, believing he's conquered existence by becoming just as unyielding and emotionally dead as a stone. So let's just quickly run through the core lessons of these 5 parables. Sever all bonds, reject empathy, enforce the law of subtraction, reframe trauma, and become the pure expression of the desert. That's his philosophy in a nutshell. It is incredibly bleak, incredibly rigid, and honestly, on the surface, it projects this aura of impenetrable, godlike invincibility. But right here is where our narrative takes a massive pivot. We have to ask, is this absolute strength we're looking at, or is it absolute fear? We've explored his hubris, we've seen the intellectual architecture of his cruelty, but what actually happens when that impenetrable armor finally gets cracked open?
Section 4. The Dying Reflection's Truth. Picture this scene for a moment. The wanderer is peering down into a pool of salt, and staring back at him is a reflection that represents his discarded humanity. Its eyes still hold the flickering lies of the sun, and it speaks to him with a voice like the last gasps of a fading flame. It forces him to confront the grim reality of what he's actually done to himself.
The reflection just instantly dismantles his whole philosophy. The wanderer likes to call his state divinity and absolute self-containment, but the reflection exposes the truth. It's not divinity at all. It is a permanent prison he's built around his own spirit. He stepped into the infinite abyss to escape the pain of being human, and in the process, he just became a jagged monument of fear. The reflection delivers this really powerful line, pointing out that by shedding his humanity, the wanderer has become a hammer that has forgotten why it strikes. He really thinks he's unmasked reality, but he's actually the most deluded of all, because stripped of empathy, stripped of all connection, his strength and power are completely devoid of purpose. He's just blindly striking at nothing. And this brings the whole mythic fable right back down to grounded, relatable psychology. The reflection points out that the wanderer literally worships the forces that broke him. He's turning scar tissue into armor because he is absolutely terrified to be soft again. He isn't strong. He is profoundly, existentially terrified of vulnerability. The very thing he judges everyone else for, weakness, is actually the absolute foundation of his entire existence. The reflection leaves him with this final, completely crushing verdict. It says, "Go then, be your missionary of desolation. Walk until the world is as silent and gray as your own heart. But remember, you are not a king. You are just the desert's most loyal mirror, reflecting a silence that you are simply too afraid to break." His coldness stems entirely from cowardice, not strength. Which leaves us with this final thought. The wanderer built an entire philosophy to justify his inability to heal. He convinced himself that his isolation was power, but as we've seen, it was really just a cage made of scar tissue. So I leave you with this question to ponder. When you build up your own emotional walls against the world, are they truly a fortress of strength, or are they merely a permanent prison? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I will catch you next time.